and I must start by thanking Deepshika Sikarwar. I really enjoy your writing. You are one of the very few economic journalists who really has the capability and the capacity to bring together such a complex panel. When we said that we're going to have this constitution of a panel, I mean, most moderators would be running scared. What is it that I'm going to add? And the only one who could handle such difficult and eminent personality that I could think of was you, and we've therefore invited you not to do just one but two panels for us today. Thank you very much. We are very grateful to you. And over to you. Please introduce the panel and the complexity. And at the end of it, do bring together some recommendations as to what the country has to do. And that's my request to each one of the panelists also, that if you could end with at least some recommendation, honest one at that, which I'm sure you would not do a dishonest job, but let's say maybe even bordering on slightly politically incorrect if it has to. And let's do that as a service to the country. Deepika.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Dr. Kocher. It's a pleasure to sort of moderate this panel. And I should not take much of the time. I mean, everybody knows my esteemed panel today, this morning. But, just for the people who are joining in, a brief introduction of each one of you. Dr. Ratin Roy, he's the Managing Director of the Overseas Development Institute. And Dr. Roy was Director NIPFP earlier and also a part-time member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Dr. Rajat Kathuria, he is Director and Chief Executive of Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Dr. Kathuria has over 20 years of experience in teaching and 15 years experience in economic policy. Next on the panel is Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi. He is Director General of RIS, and he's also a board member on the RBI. And he works on issues related to development economics involving development finance, SDGs, and South-South cooperation. We have Dr. Shekhar Shah, who is Director General, NCAER. And NCAER, as we know, is the sort of oldest and the largest economic think tank in the country. Prior to joining NCAER, Dr. Shah was World Bank's Regional Economic Advisor for South Asia. And we have Dr. Soumyakanti Ghosh. Soumyakanti Ghosh is the Group Chief Economic Advisor for the country's largest state-owned bank. And he's worked earlier at Tata, AIA, American Express, and ICRA. And he's been a co-author and he's done some pioneering work to capture the payroll data in the country, both in the formal and informal sectors. Let me welcome all of you to this morning. And it's a great pleasure sort of hosting this panel discussion. And on a very crucial topic, something which has been discussed and debated largely today. If I could just go back to what the finance minister said in her speech, in her budget speech, which was just presented. She said AatmaNirbharta is not a new idea. Ancient India was largely self-reliant and equally a business epicenter of the world. And it is an expression of 130 crore Indians who have full confidence in their capabilities and skills. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in an earlier speech defining AatmaNirbhar Bharat, had said, when a country talks about self-reliance, it is different from being self-centered. Now, the entire AatmaNirbhar program, ever since it was sort of rolled out, there have been arguments on either side. What we are now going to, but if we can deliberate on that either side, but then would be veering away from today's morning's topic, which we really want to discuss. So if I could just start with you, Dr. Roy, AatmaNirbhar program, AatmaNirbhar Bharat, as we talk about, can it really can it help India to grow beyond its potential growth rate? You're on mute, sir.
Am I audible now?
Yes, now you're.
So let me first start by paying tribute to India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who, at the expense of focusing on poverty and inequality and focusing on India's autonomy, developed the concept of self-reliance. Okay, so the Finance Minister is absolutely right. The concept of self-reliance is a concept that has imbued the very foundation of independent India. But you see, there was some dissatisfaction with the progress of this concept over the last 50 years. And therefore, in 1991, we went in for economic and trade liberalization. And much of the arguments regarding economic reforms are to allow what India decided not to do after the East India Company, which is to promote the infusion of foreign capital, quite rightly in my opinion, because India, unlike at the time of the East India Company, did not have enough capital. And therefore, we wanted to attract foreign direct investment and foreign institutional investment. And the condition for that was to keep the economy open by reducing non-tariff and trade barriers and by creating an environment where people could come in and invest in the economy. Now, where we were unclear, I think, was in whether we wish to become the producer for the world's marketplace, like China, or whether we wish to invest in our own country, or both, or if so, what and where. And that remarkable lack of clarity, I'm afraid, imbues each and every statement I've heard from this administration regarding this concept. It is not enough to translate it into Hindi. It is also very important in any language to give it meaning, and meaning does involve trade-offs and choices. I do not see those being made. On the one hand, I see a rise in import tariffs. On the other hand, I see talk about welcoming foreign businesses and lowering the cost, increasing the ease of doing business. On the one hand, I see talk about increasing exports. On the other hand, I see talk about import substitution. I'm afraid the two don't often go together, because when you parcel out an acre of land for an SEZ, it means you cannot use that acre of land to produce shirts or to build a school or to build a healthcare center. So resources deployed for exports require a policy decision and a trade-off. I do not see that calculus of trade-offs. So I think much of the talk, while admirable, is still quite loose, and certainly looser than the clarity of exposition we had between 1950 and 1970. You may agree or disagree with that policy, but it did get you a coherent pattern of self-reliance, AatmaNirbhar, which I am yet to see articulated well today. Thank you.
Dr. Shah, if I can come to you, can this concept, can this program which has been rolled out really help India achieve its potential growth?
Thank you, Deepshika. The unequivocal answer to your question has to be yes, of course. But then, as I think all thinking people have to do, they need to worry about the circumstances around which that yes actually becomes a yes and doesn't become a very sorry no. And given the big nudge that everybody has on this, it's best to perhaps focus very much on the conditions under which this Atmanirbharta can work. Let me first start by saying that the idea of a light industrial policy is not new to the economies of the world. And we've seen the Koreas, we've seen the Taiwans, we've seen a lot of East Asia precisely use this kind of light industrial policy and make tremendous inroads into the world economy. And China, of course, is the biggest example. As countries move away from China and we go to a China plus one policy, clearly there's going to be a lot of room for drawing in investment into our country. So we need to be careful about the risks that we face. And I'd like to perhaps point out 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 of those risks. Because this requires a very enlightened government that is able to keep the industrial policy light. Imagine going from 3 sectors, which is what we started with the performance-linked incentive scheme. We've now gone to 13. But imagine if in a year's time that goes to 30. Then we'll probably have a ministry for PLI. So we can see very quickly this thing gathering momentum at the wrong end, rather than at the production end, at the regulatory and the bureaucratic end. So I think there's a fear of excessive intervention. There's a fear, that's the first point, where it leads to all kinds of insider relationships that can create problems. Second, there's a concern about scope creep, that, as I said, going from 13 to 30 sectors in the next year, 2 years. Because there's always going to be a push, given the very handsome incentives, which, by the way, isn't on value addition, it's actually on value, which means that it has a huge impact in terms of those industries that get selected. And this is going to be a selection of firms. This is not going to be the whole sector gets it. There's going to be 5 firms, 6 firms, 10 firms, which requires an incredibly intelligent and light touch. And that is a problem. So scope creep can be a huge problem. Second or third is going to be a push to relax targets. We have some schemes that were supposed to end. So is there a sunset clause, and how easily will we be able to adhere to those sunset clauses, so that this is really an infant industry, not a pygmy industry argument, where we create some firms that are very large, but then they cannot survive without the protection and the incentives. The next problem is resource allocation, which industries to promote and which not to promote. That again requires incredible intelligence, foresight, and in a world in which competition is so extreme, the conditions of the 60s and 70s that East Asia had do not really obtain now. Things move much more fast, and of course everything is interconnected in global value chains. So that if we are able to handle these 5 or 6 issues, and of course at the end of it is corruption, which can create a problem. So these are the risks that we need to mitigate. And indeed, the emphasis on firms and enterprises responding to incentives is well placed, but at the same time, we absolutely need the soft infrastructure of good decision making, of government officials who are not afraid of the 4 C's. The CVC, the CBI, the CAG, and now the courts, so that they actually can take market-facing decisions that do not come to haunt them in their career. And we've seen this happening in the PPP situation, where various serious-minded, highly intelligent officers of the government are hamstrung because they are not able to take those market-facing decisions in a commercially appropriate way, which in the end is going to benefit every average citizen of the country. So I think that's a key area that we need to think about in trying to make this light industrial policy remain light, remain time-bound, and actually deliver the results that we need. I'll come to one more point, or very quickly 2 more points. I think it's very, very important that we realize that with half our population not engaged fully in paid work, and I'm talking about India's abysmally low female labor force participation rate. Our female labor force participation rate is lower than Saudi Arabia's. 1/5 of our women are in the paid labor force. Unless that changes, we're not going to be able to enjoy the employment creation opportunities that all of this is supposed to, in the end, lead to. And if that doesn't happen, then all the fears of the K-shaped recovery that people talk about will only then be drawn out into the future. and divisions within our society will become even more extreme. So it's very, very important that in thinking about these things, we also worry about the social end of what we are doing. And it's going to be very, very important. Last, I think Ratin referred to it, there is a messaging problem in AatmaNirbhar Bharat. Delhi High Court judgment apparently recently looking at ground operations for airports and regional airports made some remarks about, oh, but this is not going to mean production in India. So, this vocal for local really should be vocal for global. It is a kind of a extension of Make in India, but really we sometimes have to worry about self-sufficiency ending up being just protectionism. And guarding against that, and the trend has been towards that, really is very important. I'll make one last point, which is that in 1991, a bunch of very committed reformers could do what they had to do because they were undoing something. They were undoing the license Raj, and a lot of those were stroke of the pen reforms. Today, we are redoing it, but trying to redo it in a very light and sophisticated way. And that's going to require immense talent and understanding of the global economy and of India's economy than was the case in 1991. So it is a 1991 moment in reverse, but we need to make sure that it actually delivers the goods that it's supposed to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Dr. Kathuria, as a Atmanirbharta, the concept, Dr. Shah has raised some very pertinent points. Do you see as this philosophy really taking us back to pre-91? The tariff barriers, protectionists, and coming back to my first question, can it really deliver the growth that we are aspiring for?
Thanks, Deepshika. And at the outset, let me thank Samir for once again inviting me to speak here and for assembling this formidable cast of panelists and friends. And I'm really grateful that we're able to speak together once again, not just at Sachin said at the Five Institute budget seminar, but at other platforms that SKOCH has provided all of us. This is I think as both Ratin and Shekhar have said, this is a big challenge of messaging. I think it's a big challenge of clarity and I think also of implementation. There's nothing wrong with being Atmanirbhar, but one has to ensure that you don't end up in contradictions. I mean, policy, at the heart of policy are trade-offs. And I think as economists all agree that we have to make choices. You can't have more of everything, and economics will be a very dull subject if there were no trade-offs. I mean, the whole idea of policy is trade-offs. The whole idea is that you create winners and losers, and policy making thus becomes an art, and to use a sort of an oft-used maxim in trade theory is that if the winners can compensate the losers somehow, if you can develop institutions for the winners to compensate the losers, then trade actually makes everybody better off in a Pareto sense, and then we can all go home. But unfortunately, those domestic institutions have not been able to be developed anywhere in the world. And therefore, trade remains hostage to sort of industrial policy, to political interventions, and so on. But having contradictions, I think, is given, or trade-offs. If contradictions being a slightly more more intense word, or describes the situations more darkly. But in a soft sense, you would say there are trade-offs. But Joe Robinson many years ago said India is there are contradictions in India. Sort of what is true in India at the same time, the exact opposite would be true, and that still remains so. Except that I think Atmanirbharta today versus Atmanirbharta or self-sufficiency of the 70s and 80s is very different. We added that, as Shekhar said, in 1991. So they are very, very different. They were, import substitution and export promotion sort of existed at the same time, and both very intensively. The import tariff was 400%. at that time, on average, and you didn't want consumer goods coming in. I remember in the Planning Commission, there used to be discussions like, oh, we cannot open up our borders to foreign investment because we will fritter away our resources on making brill cream, etc. So we will waste our resources on consumer goods and useless goods while we need capital. And we recognized very quickly in 1991 that those contradictions were actually retrograde for the economy, because if you did not allow foreign investment and picked and chose foreign investment in a situation where your growth rates were abysmal and inflation was very high, nobody was interested to invest in India. So export promotion did not happen because import substitution was pervasive, it was very high, and it was almost what economists call prohibitive tariffs were imposed. And therefore, what ended up happening was you produced goods that nobody in the world wanted at very high prices to a captive audience. I mean, it was classic monopoly, it was classic protectionism. And therefore, we had, and a lot of us know about the sectors that this affected, and sectors that it affected endemically were the automobile sector, the telecommunication sector, the two-wheeler sector. I mean, the waiting lists for telephones were 5 years. You could get out of turn if you had proximity with the powers that be, and this was true for automobiles, this was true for scooters. If you paid foreign exchange, you would get it out of turn. So the whole sort of economy around this political economy around production, supply, and demand was one of how well did you know the powers that be who could then allocate you, assign you a good that you wanted. And let's cut to today. Today's AatmaNirbharta, I think, is different. But at the same time, I think there are trade-offs that need to be made. It's not as stark as the pre-91 situation, but I think the clarity in the messaging is not there. There are contradictions. And let me just point to 2 or 3 contradictions and say, or trade-offs, and say that we've not made the right choices. One is we often say that we want to add more value addition at home, more make in India. And obviously that is through the route of foreign direct investment, because we're liberalizing foreign direct investment. Now, if you look at global value chains today, and you look at the dispersion of global value chains, you open up any good or a laptop, you'll see that the product is perhaps made in several countries, not just one, but they are made in several countries, maybe 20, 25. Apple could be made, the final product could be made in 25 countries. Now, what happens there when you have developments in communications, when you have developments in logistics like containerization, what happens is that when a good or a component crosses borders multiple times because of these developments, and because it is sort of advantageous to do so, the value addition, not the gross exports, the value addition of any one country will naturally be lower. So the value addition is inversely proportional to the number of times a good crosses borders. And that's natural. So to say that I'm going to add more value while there are all these developments happening in the rest of the world, comes perilously close to confusing absolute advantage with comparative advantage. So we may have an absolute advantage in everything, but we don't have a comparative advantage in everything, which is the essence of trade theory, I think. So to focus on just trying to add value and say we are only going to do things that give us whole value, and therefore raise import barriers, as Rathin was saying, import substitute, then you're not going to be able to become globally competitive. It is a slow, arduous, and a painstaking process to become globally competitive. China has shown the way. We are not a China, of course, but they've shown the way. They opened up foreign direct investment. They did not have any restrictions in the beginning. Now they have, because they have more bargaining power, more negotiating power today because of the size of their economy and because of their sort of growth, both in a military, political, and economic sense. But when you're in a stage where India is today, when we want to take off, We need global markets to be able to become competitive in more ways than one, including through importing efficient products and services and technology so that we can become more efficient at home. There are no shortcuts to this. It's not just because you impose a high tariff on a PCBA does not mean you will be able to produce that efficiently at home. That's not the answer. I mean, there's learning by doing. There is going to be adaptation. There's going to be import of technology. So my only sort of concern is that while AatmaNirbhar suffers from some of the problems that the earlier speakers have spoken about, I think there are going to be trade-offs, and we have to recognize what we can do, what is our comparative advantage, and exploit that comparative advantage rather than saying, oh, I'm going to design a phone today. I'm going to become the hub of design because I want to move up the value chain right in the beginning. So that's sort of my clear message is be careful in what choices you make for the PLI, be careful what choices you make for, make in India or increasing value addition at home, because it's not going to happen so easily. We need global markets to be able to become competitive. And therefore, protectionism, this creep towards protectionism is not going to serve our country well in the future. So AatmaNirbharta can deliver. It's a good idea, especially from the lens of jobs, but we have to be careful in our implementation. We don't have absolute advantage in doing everything. That's the message pre-90s. That's the message of import substitution and export promotion, the failure of both those policies in India. One final point, Deepshika, is on what I want to say about protectionism is that it's no longer a source of revenue for the government. So this argument that we're increasing protection or tariffs for revenue for the government, that's not true, because basic customs duty as a percentage of total revenue for the government is declining and will probably decline further. So this is clear that the rise in import tariffs is for want to promote a Make in India, you want to promote your domestic industry, but there are other better instruments to protect domestic industry, or rather I'd use the word incentivize domestic industry to become more competitive. And those instruments are at home, and I don't want to dwell on those. Everybody of us knows what those instruments are to make India, a better ranker or move up the hierarchy of ease of doing business, come into the top 50, and all those package of reforms and execution that lie at the heart of improving the ease of doing business, especially for small and medium enterprises. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. Let me come to you, Dr. Chaturvedi. 2 points. Can AatmaNirbhar program deliver, the growth that we are aspiring for? And also what the previous panelists have said, the points that they've raised about whether AatmaNirbhar Bharat is about becoming more protectionist, and can it really help in delivering the growth that we are looking for?
Thank you. Thanks, Deepshika, and I must also thank SKOCH for getting this very stimulating theme across AatmaNirbhar growth, and you rightly said whether it is sustainable or how we are going to address the issues that are related to trade. Just 3 points I would like to make. First and foremost, Deepshika, that is extremely important for us to see AatmaNirbhar India with international competitiveness, and that I think is crafts that we heard from Dr. Shah, Ratin, and Rajat. All three have emphasized on different contours of this international competitiveness, and that I think is important for us. Not at the aggregate level, but also at the sectoral level. And the fact that within PLI, we would have to choose few champions, the sectors that we think are where we are going to deliver, be that electronic parts and components, or we think of sectors where in agriculture processing, like in the Finance Commission report, I was part of the agriculture exports group, and we have identified sectors where Indian firms can deliver within agriculture. So we would have to identify some sectors where we can deliver. And for that, I think it is important to put house in order. The issues related to logistic costs in India, there are several sectors, and a colleague of mine has just finished a study in which we have shown how in several sectors, India is more competitive than China in cost of production of those products. And we show that what we are losing out is from production site to the shipping point. So the logistic costs are so high. If it is $2.5 for China, for India, it is $9.8 to reach out. In some cases, it is even 15. So where would you compete? So you need to reduce the logistic costs. Fortunately, government has paid huge attention. Much more is required in terms of ease of doing business and reducing the cost of transaction. So I think that is absolutely essential and important. The second part is the cost of production in certain areas. So whether we think of SEZs, and at some point NCR did marvelous job in terms of capturing this cost of production. I think important to see if the idea of SEZs, which earlier ended up with land grab and whatnot. But I think in this government, if more attention is paid, probably India requires some success story, at least in some part of the country, so that other states can emulate that. And fortunately, Prime Minister personally has focused on the Bharatmala project, developing 41 major ports, and this has revolutionized our ability to export. The Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor that Japan is supporting us, and then the Mumbai-Bangalore industrial corridor, Bangalore-Hyderabad industrial corridor. These are the new ideas that are there, and they are not just confined to paper, they are reality now. So you are contributing to this narrative making, you are contributing to the change scenario, and I think it is absolutely important. Deepshika, as you yourself have captured the issue of the, for instance, the cost of electricity, the amount that an industrialist has to pay. So how you reduce logistic cost, how you reduce the cost of electricity, labor, I don't have to say much, but I think that is important. But most important is capital. In the internal working group report of RBI, we have articulated that you require efforts to enhance the access to the ability of the firms to access credit and reduce the cost of that. So if more penetration has to be done, you require banks with a greater bandwidth. And the proposal of DFI, I think, is something which is simply outstanding. The issue is how you bring in a narrative that is required in terms of financing your infrastructure and development that is needed. So a sort of disconnect should not come in when you are going to go for an institution like this. So AatmaNirbhar growth, in my view, I think would depend on the way we are creating our institutions, be that DFI or the DISCOMs that we are trying to address. Issues related to logistic costs is going to be a crucial factor in AatmaNirbhar growth. And if we put that right, we are almost there. And as you know, Deepshika, the 5 pillars that have been defined in our AatmaNirbhar Bharat sort of program, the idea of the economy, infrastructure, systems, the vibrant demography, and of course demand, they require to address what kind of business model you are creating for MSMEs, what kind of issues are there in terms of skills. I mean, that's one big deficiency, as several reports of NCR time and again have shown in terms of how skill is an issue. The kind of growth that we are already seeing is important, but then the market connects are not there. Fortunately, now for the first time in last so many years, Cabinet has day before yesterday passed a very limited proposal of our free trade agreement with Mauritius. RIS did that study 5 years ago. Can you believe it? And 3 years ago, China signed a free trade agreement with Mauritius. Just day before yesterday, Cabinet has approved India-Mauritius free trade agreement. This is happening at a time when Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, AFCFTA, on 1st January 2021 has become effective. I'm not saying that we need to jump in all the FTAs, but this is very much about AatmaNirbhar Bharat and international competitiveness. We need to bring it. Even if we have thought of sequencing of providing protection, I see that exit routes should be very clearly articulated, emphasized, and be foretold in terms of how we are going to open up. Because we cannot have endless protectionism. For 70 years, we have seen it has not delivered. It has not delivered in India. It has not delivered in many parts of the world. But we also require Indian industry not to end up with monopolistic situations that we have witnessed in certain sectors. The effort that has been made, I think, in terms of industrial policy, and I'm glad Dr. Shah has captured it, is in terms of the convergence that is required. And from RIS, we have already articulated that new industrial policy and the trade policy, which is in the offing, they should be merged. We should have a combined industrial and trade policy. I would have very much liked that to have the science, technology, innovation component as well, which is in now in public domain for comments, the STIP 2020. So STIP 2020, Indian industrial policy and the trade policy that is likely to be sort of soon announced, which would be till 2025. I think these three policies, if combined together, would give the heft that is required in our address to the issues that are there for our AatmaNirbhar growth with international competitiveness. Last point that I want to mention is in terms of our approach in terms of reforms, and I think this budget was quite clear in terms of how and what direction we are going. If you look at our performance during the lockdown, the way the PPE goods could come up, the way vaccine could come up, the way industry responded to ventilators, etc. So given an opportunity, our industry has responded. It has come up to the expectations that the nation has. And from that point of view, I think the institutional reforms that are needed to unleash energies in industrial production and manufacturing, I think is extremely important. And we know very well that if India has to get into international market in terms of industrial manufacturing exports, the niche lies in high-end technology-intensive manufacturing. And that would come in only when we combine our science, technology, innovation policy with our industrial policy. And that would happen only when the amount of capital that is required, because it would need huge investments. So you need to reduce the cost of access to capital. And for that, you require banks which have the bandwidth to give. The public sector enterprises and the banks cannot deliver. You require capital which is there to be locked for 20 years, 25 years, and that bandwidth, unfortunately, not many banks have. So we require the financial sector reforms. And I think, Deepshika, the country has come at a point when multi-sectoral interdependence has become a reality. So you require these convergences to be explored when we bring in. And fortunately, I would say this budget has tried to address several of these dimensions in one go. And before I close, I must mention about AatmaNirbhar growth not to be a non-green growth. It has to be a green growth. It has to have the component of sustainability. It has to have a lower carbon footprint. And that, I think, is an effort which is extremely important. In the previous component of this discussion, I had mentioned about the Sustainable Development Goals, the sustainability part of it. Fortunately, in this budget, several issues have come up in terms of green finance, how our international commitments are to be addressed. At this point, I am myself part of a study at RIS where we are trying to see how much India is going to pay more if we go for green deal, green finance deal, if we continue to remain stuck with Basel norms. So how much capital access cost is going up with the nature of Basel norms that are being thrusted upon us? So that dimension, I think, is important, not only for India, but for many other developing countries. And at RIS, we have been trying to see some of these dimensions in further details as India's BRICS presidency is going forward this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi. If I can come to you, Soumyakanti Ghosh, can AatmaNirbharta deliver the growth that we are aspiring for? And what Dr. Chaturvedi highlighted, the cost of capital and the cost of readiness of the financial sector, the institutional strength that we have in financial sector. Is it prepared? Is it ready to really support the kind of growth that we are looking at?
Okay. Thank you, SKOCH Foundation. Thank you, Sami, for giving me this opportunity to be here. And thank you all the panelists, and special thanks to Dr. Shah and Dr. Chaturvedi for the wonderful achievement. We have been following everybody's research, beginning Dr. Roy, Dr. Katuria, and this gives a lot of food for thought every time we go through the research and the articles which come out. Now, having said that, let me now come to this point of the AatmaNirbhar Bharat, and specifically the points which you mentioned regarding the financial sector. I think one of the points regarding the AatmaNirbhar Bharat, I'll just take a step back and say that in May, when these 5 pillars were announced, I think these 5 pillars, as Professor Chaturvedi rightly says, was an economy, then infrastructure, systems, demography, and dividends. And I think since then, there has been a series of initiatives which has been announced by the government, which pertain to each of these sectors. For example, for the economy, there has been specific policies to address the rural sector, the MSME sector. There has been also been specific policy to address the power distribution sector, the civil aviation sector, the atomic research and other space sectors. So there has been defense, indigenous manufacturing. So there's been a lot of steps have been announced. And it's important to understand that how basically this AatmaNirbhar concept comes. So I think there has been concerns which has been expressed. Some of these actually are right in terms of saying that the cost of tariff should not go up. But we need to understand and appreciate that at the end of the day, the AatmaNirbhar Bharat communication should be such that it is about channelizing Indian strengths, and it should not be about protectionism. So while there has been, of course, an increase in tariffs in some of the cases, but at the end of the day, there should be this should be constituted as a message to channelize India's strengths. It reminds me of this, when I am talking about this self-reliant conference, it reminds me of this 2008 crisis when US and China, actually US enlarged its shale production to reduce its dependence on oil. And China at that same point of time was actually moved into the lower end of the manufacturing production. And since then, if you look into the US and the way the oil prices, the US has actually become more self-dependent, and China has actually vacated the low manufacturing space, which India is now trying to capture through the several initiatives which the government is trying to introduce. Now, having said all these things, I think coexistence of ideas in terms of AatmaNirbhar Bharat, self-reliance, protectionism, can always coexist. I think in economic theory, if you look into the examples of theory, they are replete with such arguments. If I just go back in 1974, when Hayek and Gunnar Myrdal were added the Nobel Prize, both of their ideas are completely contrasting. In 2013, when Robert Shiller and Eugen Fama were added the Nobel Prize, both have ideas which are completely contrasting. So contrasting ideas can coexist, but we need to give a proper message that this is exactly what we are achieving for. And in that sense, I think the issue of India's AatmaNirbhar Bharat being more about self-reliance and not about protectionism needs to be pushed through more vigorously. Now, if you ask me about the specific question of the financial sector, whether it is able to support, yes, from the country's largest bank, I can say that the financial sector has actually undergone a lot of turmoil from 2018 onwards. The turmoil actually reached its peak with the onset of the pandemic. But the good thing is that I think the government and of course the Reserve Bank of India, and I should compliment the Reserve Bank of India for doing an excellent job in actually trying to ward off this financial contagion. In fact, this reminds me again of if I ask me of the Reserve Bank of India, in 2003, there was a speech by Ben Bernanke where he talked about this constrained discretion in monetary policy making. And I think this Reserve Bank of India has been exactly doing this. They have been doing discretionary policy responses, and the way they have accommodated the significant borrowing requirements of the government, which was as record high last year, this year also it will be a record high, and the government being able to borrow at the lowest rate in the 16 years. And that actually has been a tremendous job, as you can see in the markets, the way they have been behaving in the last 2-3 auctions. But the central bank has been able to manage till date the significant debt management program of the government in the most assiduous and non-restrictive manner. They have brought back financial stability to the market. They have ensured the fastest rate transmission is happening in the market, and they have actually allowed the NBFC sector to borrow at lower cost. So I think some of these measures will actually go a long way in ensuring financial stability to the market. This is not to say that the problems in the financial sector has gone away, but the important thing is that, again, if you ask me, when the pandemic started, all of us had a fear that the asset quality of the banks actually will go kaput. There was a lot of writing saying that the total 100 lakh crores is the outstanding credit of the banking system. So maybe around 20 lakh crores of these could become NPA. But I think the banks here, the central bank, and also to some extent, and also to the extent the government has used the IBC code, I think that has helped to bring about a decorum of financial discipline for the borrowers. That is the reason why you will see today that the restructuring advances which has come to the banks has been significantly on the lower side, because it is from this restructuring advances only that the NPA arises. So this is another surprising and good development which has happened. Of course, this doesn't say maybe, tell the entire story that the MSME sector is obviously under some sort of duress, and to some extent the agricultural sector because of other reasons, others. But even if we admit that, the way the banking sector has performed during the pandemic, and it is important to understand that all the global banks, because the banking sector this year has gone into the crisis with adequate capital and adequate provisioning. If you ask foreign banks, like for example, State Bank of India, which is 25% of India's market share, we have a provisioning ratio of 90%. So that means that whenever the next crisis, if it occurs, the banks are adequately capitalized and provisioned for that. And perhaps this has been the most important learning from the 2008 crisis, which may allow the financial sector to reboot itself from what it was expected during the beginning of the pandemic. So, and there have also been some very good steps in the budget. The most important thing in the budget is the creation of a bad bank. I think there is enormous benefits of a bad bank. Even the fact that if you have provided 90 to 100% of your provisioning, that means the capital requirement will be significantly on the lower side. If the capital requirement is on the lower side, and if you are able to recover the amount, even if 10 to 20% of such a high amount is recovered, and the provisioning amount also could be saved, that could have a significant impact on the bank balance sheet and profitability. I think some of these things needs to be properly understood by the financial markets, and some of these things needs to be properly communicated that these are the benefits. And also the advantages of an infrastructural-led growth, as has been laid down in the vision of AatmaNirbhar Bharat, I think that is important. But my sense is that now, if I want to end over here, I think the concept of this AatmaNirbharata has, with the self-reliance concept, and possibly not to do with protectionism, should now be properly addressed in the sense that the budget has laid down the steps in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the financial sector, things which needs to do in terms of, for example, and DFI has also been introduced. So I think these things now need to properly work together and implementing fast enough so that the benefits of these, benefits of all these steps could be taken quickly by the market, because we are running against time. The pandemic has significantly disrupted us, but fortunately the growth rate has recovered. For whatever reasons, for the resilience of the economy, for the global economy has also recovered faster than what we had anticipated. So if we have to take consideration of all these factors, we need to work fast on some of the steps which has been issued in the budget. And I am sure that the financial sector today is much more robust and resilient than what we have thought about at the beginning of the pandemic, possibly because of this significant coordination of the monetary and fiscal policy, which has been happening over the last 1 year. And I don't know, at the end of the day, I think because the fiscal policy has postponed the fiscal deficit to 4.6% by 2005 to 26. But for the first time, the deficit numbers in the budget is also transparent. The off-balance sheet liabilities have been put into the headline one. So if I want to look into all this prism positively, I hope that this continues and the government is able to do on the promises which is made in the budget, because even if 70 to 80% of these promises could be made, I think that would augur very well for the markets.
Thank you, Soumya. One issue which, when we talk about the whole AatmaNirbhar Bharat, what really strikes me is that we are sort of, in fact, even the government policy is focused on reviving manufacturing. It is very manufacturing sector focused. Now, can at this stage India really rest back any significant manufacturing on strength of SOPs and the large market, the steady market that it has? And also, how do you sort of ensure that it is geographically equitable? Because we've seen in the past that some states tend to attract more investment, some states do not. They are unable to do so, especially in terms of manufacturing. So, Dr. Shah, if I could come to you.
Sure. So there's always going to be regional imbalances, just to take your last question first. And I don't think that's going to be something that you can avoid. Every state, as Rajat said, we need to think about comparative advantage. It may be easier to produce everything in Maharashtra, but then there are things in the Northeast that the Northeast has actually a comparative advantage in as compared to Maharashtra. So there's going to be regional imbalances. The real issue is mobility within the country and mobility within the labor force. And if that happens, then clearly we are likely to see a much greater impact of this. But let me go back to the earlier question and just kind of summarizing a lot of the things that people have said. And I think we all said the same thing in some ways about messaging. That, Atmanirbharta should not become, and I'm very conscious of the SKOTCH acronym that Samir uses, it should not become AatmaSankoch. And of course, Sankoch is also SANKOCH. So I'm worried that AatmaNirbhar will become AatmaSankoch or AatmaSandeh, where we will feel that we are protecting our own interest, but in doing so, we actually are becoming more vulnerable. And I would much rather think of Vishwanirbharta as a way in which we integrate ourselves more and more on an equal footing, on an advantageous footing with the rest of the world. So I would, if I were messaging, I would say it's Atmanirbharta, but think of it as Vishwa Nirbharta, in the sense that we are going to be confident about facing up to the world. So that's my sense about how there is going to be potentially this messaging problem that will be addressed. As to the question of differences in the way in which, and I don't think these are SOPs, it's precisely the risk that they don't become SOPs that we need to guard against. That's a tough call, particularly given the traditions of our government, the traditions of our state. Here we actually need to think about how individual states will implement this. And I think that's a big laboratory that we need to be thinking about. One last thing I would say is that we should bring the whole notion of design thinking into this Atmanirbharta idea. And that, I'm afraid, is still missing. And what does design thinking mean? It means that you innovate, you pilot, you learn, and then you come to some kind of formalization. We tend to jump to scale very quickly, and that's a big worry in this regard. But at the same time, there's obviously an urgency about having to do things much faster, because we want to accelerate the recovery. We want to get back to a pre-pandemic growth trajectory. We want to be able to recover rapidly and sustain that recovery. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Shah. Dr. Roy, if you could sort of elaborate on, this intense manufacturing focus in the whole AatmaNirbhar program, and the fact on, the dispersal in terms of the states. How do you ensure equitable, growth or equitable Atmanirbharta geographically within the country?
Okay, thanks. Let me first make a point here, which I think it is important to make, which is that, you see, if you look at the track record of the Indian growth story, and you look at how state intervention has dealt with it, you will find that the success stories in India are when tasks that have to be secured are of low levels of complexity, even if high at scale. I often encapsulate this, but before that, let me give you some examples. So India performed extremely well in managing Kumbh Melas, in managing elections, in vaccinating people, and that is paying off. Now, I think our vaccination program is being admirably managed. Our lockdown was admirably managed. But remember, these are tasks of magnitude, but they're not complex tasks. The moment you try and address tasks that require complexity and consistent attention, educating our children, developing a healthcare system as opposed to vaccinations, you find that we falter. Which is why I often say that I would like the finance ministry to be as efficient as the home ministry. But the reason why the finance ministry is not as efficient as the home ministry is that an administrative civil service can execute tasks of low complexity and high and scale and magnitude. But to deal with complexity, you need to go beyond government. You need to create coalitions that are able to address complexity. I think Shekhar's comment on design thinking, is very, very pertinent in that context. And that is where we will need to see a more inclusive, strategic vision for India, not one where somebody sent out marching orders from a hill in Delhi and then everyone else follows. When it comes to the states, this is particularly important because remember, the central government has been broke for some time. There is no money in central government. Whatever the big talk about capital investment, it is still the case, and it will be the case next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, that between 65 and 80% of borrowing will be used for revenue expenditure, not for capital expenditure. So optics aside and intentions aside, the complex task of making sure that we manage government finances at the central government level not to do this is not being addressed, with the result that the states are being robbed of resources. Fiscally prudent states are being robbed of resources because the government of India is resorting more and more to cesses which are not shareable with the states. Even the Finance Commission's report expects the share of cesses in total revenues to go up in 25-26. So to deprive of the most important partner within the umbra of government with the financial means to engage in this common task, I think is regrettable and would need to be reversed. Second, take privatization or disinvestment or whatever you want to call it. This cannot be done in a note sheet. It's not like imposing a lockdown. It's not like, dealing with a border problem and converting a state to union territory. It requires sophistication, executive capability, and that is there. It is there in the different states of India. It is there in the private sector. It is there within academia. It is there in our diaspora. But we choose not to bring these together to have an India disinvestment strategy rather than a government of India disinvestment strategy. Again, therefore, failing to use national resources, which I think would be a very pro-national act, to secure tasks of complexity which the government from 1950 onwards has shown, with some exceptions, repeated incapacity to enact. Complexity, on the other hand, at the state government level can be dealt with because the application of that complexity is smaller. A final point. It is all very well to talk about a single labor market. But why is it that people have to emigrate at great cost, including the railways, logistics, etc., thousands of kilometers to find jobs, and then are continued not accepted in those societies where they go, but as if they've been to Dubai or London, called migrant labor, and be told to, and thrown out back to their villages? That's the lesson we learned in the pandemic. My grandfather migrated to Bombay. I'm not considered migrant labor in Maharashtra. Whereas people now who migrate in our new India are considered migrants, and the obligation to them is to come and work at wages that they find, and anything else they want to do, they must be thrown back. Institutions like One Ration Card to some extent alleviate this, but they do not solve the fundamental problem. The jobs are not being created where the population is, and the jobs, and therefore whether it's manufacturing or services, agriculture, need to be located closer to where people live and where their citizenship is recognized and where they are included, for better or worse, notwithstanding the caste system, etc., in those societies. That means improving both the quality of life, the political governance, and most important, deciding what to produce that can be consumed, with the skills available in the parts of India, which is North and the East, which have the majority of the population, by those who produce them in those areas. So I think the task is to ask that. If you ask that, I've written about this extensively, there are 5 things that you should and can be able to produce without subsidy. Cheap textiles, housing, food, that is a decent meal, good health and good education. If you deliver the production and consumption of these things where in the North and the East, and there are complex issues that I can't go into them now. Textiles is an interesting case in point, where we make shirts for rich people in India, but we import 82% of shirts that cost less than 300 rupees from Bangladesh and Vietnam and China, right? This is a very strange kind of AatmaNirbhar for the rich, but importing for the poor, and thereby losing out that market. If we are able to solve that problem, then the kind of dynamic value chain propositions that we see globally will be fostered at home. It will make the economy cheaper, and then we will be able to think about instituting more complex industries, more complex ways of economic working, more remunerative economies in these areas. But the first step has to be to produce using labor where it is located and where it can consume in large quantity what is produced. That, I think, should be the cornerstone of AatmaNirbhar. And it is very surprising to me, in conclusion, I'm going to make a politically ideological point, especially to the ruling party. I'm a great fan of Deen Dayal Upadhyayji's, work. And Antyodaya has never been taken as part of AatmaNirbhar. So I'm not asking the ruling party to go beyond its own ideology. I'm asking it to recognize it, understand it, and implement it. And if that happens, I'm quite confident we'll get out of this. But that is the level of structural change that is required in this economy to address the very important point you made about equity across the country and truly inclusive growth and participation in the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. Dr. Kathuria, if I can come to you, this focus on manufacturing and what Dr. Roy highlighted, how do you sort of ensure that this AatmaNirbhar growth that we will get, it'll be to ensure that it's geographically equitable? It reaches all the states, it ensures development at the ground level in each and every state.
Yeah, I think let me sort of extend the argument, or not extend, just reinforce what Ratan has said and what the previous speakers have also said. I think the focus on manufacturing is a given for a country like India. I think the focus on manufacturing, and also I think the weakness in manufacturing, and we know those reasons. We focused on manufacturing. We wanted to get it up to 25% of GDP. China had upwards of 40% of their GDP, 50% of their GDP in manufacturing. And some say we've missed the bus. Some say that we can get there. But the focus on manufacturing there is a method in the madness. And the method is that, we are a country which is labor abundant. Manufacturing is much more labor intensive than other tasks. And importantly, the point that Ratan made is labor intensive at the lower end. So you're looking at textiles, you're looking at toys, you're looking at leather, you're looking at agriculture processing, you're looking at things which are labor intensive, which are manufacturing oriented, to be able to productively employ the vast labor force that is both coming in to the labor force for the first time, as well as the ones that are in a structural sense being displaced from agriculture and are coming into the labor force. Because as you know, as economies grow, there will be displacement from agriculture and there will be new entrants into the labor force as long as you are on that high demographic profile, or the upward swing of the curve of the demographic profile. And that's the sort of reason why we focused on manufacturing. And a lot of our industry has actually defied, as an economic survey put it, has defied our comparative advantage and moved into services, which is not labor intensive. And the services that we've got in the country are actually low-end services, which are not exportable, which are, services that are for the domestic market, and these are low-end services. So the question then, to answer your question, is the focus on manufacturing misplaced? Is the technology going to sort of not help us deliver the kind of jobs that we need from manufacturing? Or have we missed the bus? And should we rely much more on services? And I think this has been a question that has been discussed and debated in India ad nauseum. But in my own writings and what ICRIER has been doing in the past few years, is that our focus on manufacturing is not misplaced. I think we can still, climb on to that bus, manufacturing bus, labor-intensive bus, but we have to do it in a strategic manner. And I think, as Atul Kohli has said in much of his work of political economy across at least East Asia and of course Latin America also, is that where India has fallen short in terms of public policy is not so much in the design of public policy. Of course, one can debate that, but it's been in the execution and implementation and sort of corruption and the transactions cost whenever it is with dealing with the government, whether it is state government, central government, or with the local government. And famous words were spoken about that, big industries in India succeeded not because they were entrepreneurial in nature, not because they were innovative of what they did. They succeeded because of their proximity to the government. So proximity to the government was the comparative advantage. It wasn't entrepreneurship that was the comparative advantage. It wasn't innovation that was the comparative advantage. And I think services showed that is not necessarily true. If you open the market up, entrepreneurial skills can actually lead you to growth. Unfortunately, those services-oriented sectors are not labor-intensive, and therefore we have to fall back on manufacturing. What has happened in the past that countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh have stolen a march from us and we have not been able to attract those value chains that have been displaced from China to coming into India. And I think we should still strive to do that. And we can, as I said in my opening remarks, it's not protectionism that will get you there. The focus has to be on your domestic, as Sachin was saying, get your domestic house in order, get your taxes, get your power regime, all those things that we talk about. Let me go into, it's repetition to the extent it becomes boring when you talk about it all the time, the same things. But as Sachin was also saying, that policy making, you have to be often reinforcing the same things that you said 10 years ago. So we have to focus on the ease of doing business. And I think you will unleash the entrepreneurial spirit. It's like throwing somebody into the swimming pool like we did in 1991. It's not that Indian industry did not respond. Indian industry responded well, I think, to the reforms of 1991. When you throw people into the deep end, they will respond. But it's much easier to ask for protectionism, to lobby for protectionism. And if you get it, it's like lazy banking of the 90s. You got at 5% and you lent at 8% and you are happy, you did your due diligence. It's lazy manufacturing. You ask for protectionism, you get it, and you don't have to be innovative. You're working in a protected market. I'm exaggerating, but that's what it is. So manufacturing is something that we need to do, not through for our population. Of course, education, health, all the other things that Ratin also spoke so eloquently about we need to do. But we still haven't missed the manufacturing bus, this fourth industrial revolution that will dump all the manufacturing jobs and we won't have them. I think it's not true for countries like India, which have labor abundance. It's still cheaper to be able to employ a person compared to the capital investment that you need to make in robos or algorithms. I think robo per capita in India is the lowest in the world of the labor force. So I think that fear is a little overplayed and it is a little alarmist. So I'm still the manufacturing, sort of I'm voting for the manufacturing bus for India to become a labor-intensive powerhouse of manufacturing. Maybe it's not as easy to do it as it was when Korea and China did that, or but I think we still have time to climb onto that bus. On your question of regional inequality and balance, I think Hirschman spoke about many years ago, The Economist. I think it's a difficult thing to do. I remember Pura, that was mentioned by one of our late presidents, providing urban amenities in rural areas to prevent migration. And I think the balance of empirical evidence suggests that it hasn't worked. Well, we haven't been able to build the infrastructure in rural areas, but I think it won't work. People will converge to cities. People will converge to areas where the jobs are. People will converge to places where there are livelihoods. And we know reverse migration is happening from places where pollution, as Sachin was emphasizing so correctly, where pollution and climate change are having an impact. People are going back to villages. And that flow is, you're not going to be able to, through a decree or an administrative order that China did, be able to prevent that. I think regional imbalances are a given. We will have cities, as we said, in 2030 and 2050, we will have 53 cities in India which will have more than 1 million people. That is the projection. And even if that is wrong by 5%, you know where the people are going to be. National Capital Region in 2040 will have 7 to 10% of our GDP, and will have a labor force or population of 300 million of therefore. So we're going to have very large number of people living in clusters, living in areas, cities, and greater extended metropolitan areas. Delhi will beat Tokyo as the greatest metropolitan area in the world very soon. So I think regional imbalances will occur. Administratively, trying to sort of prevent that from happening is a policy that is something or wrought with risk. I think not going to happen. So you take that as a given that regional imbalances will occur. You create satellites and that will emerge, and will, just like Delhi now is in a concentric circle which attracts people from the neighborhood. You'll build others. Near Gurgaon will become a satellite for the hinterland, and so on and so forth. It will go on expanding, and your concentric circle will go on expanding in that sense. And therefore, but imbalances will remain. You need to be close to your markets. You need to be close to where you are able to produce efficiently, so that you want to remain competitive. So I won't be too worried about these imbalances. They will remain. We of course need to reduce them, but I think manufacturing is the story that India needs to sort of reinvigorate and get back on track.
I know Dr. Roy has to leave, so I'm just coming to you, Dr. Roy. If you could just give 2 suggestions which would be passed on to the government later on how effectively can AatmaNirbhar Bharat be made to deliver. Some 2 points which you think the government should focus on.
Understand that delivering a strong, inclusive India, whatever Hindi, English, Sanskrit, Urdu name you want to use for it, including AatmaNirbhar Bharat, requires addressing complexity. Understand that India is AatmaNirbhar in the sense that we have the resources to deliver this complexity, but those resources don't sit within government and cannot be mobilized on file. Therefore, if you cannot reform government to move it from administrative to executive in its orientation, which I think for other reasons is difficult, I have sympathy, then I think it is important to think of these things as India strategies. Create an India strategy for disinvestment, create an India strategy for dispersion, create an India strategy for manufacturing, which need not be led by government. So government has to give up its insistence on leading everything, and the people of India have to accept it. We have to grow up a bit and understand that we must lead, and that the government can support, facilitate, etc. I know that at least 5 years ago, the Prime Minister felt that this was very strongly lacking. But perhaps it is lacking because when we create these strategies, we create them sitting in Delhi and Bombay. And it does not speak to the people who are capable of delivering these at complexity. We see this with countless experiments in health and education. So that is the first. Let's create an India strategy. Let's get an India-wide conversation going. Instead of dividing, let us bring people together to a common cause. I think that teaches the messaging and communication. That's one, very important. The second I would say is, I've been saying this for years, get 5 things right first. Let's make sure that half the Indian population, using the incomes they earn, not through subsidy, using the incomes they earn, have access to a square meal, are able to buy, in the case of men, a shirt costing less than 300 rupees that is made in India, have access to a decent habitation, a modest but decent habitation, using their own money to pay the EMIs necessary to do so, half the population, yeah? Have access to a good healthcare system, have access to a good education system. That itself will triple employment. With that demand base and that skills base, we can then look forward to more complex things like improving manufacturing, etc. But we have to get these 5 things right. And if you note the difference between countries like South Korea, China, Japan, Taiwan, and countries like Brazil, the Philippines, and Thailand, is that they did not focus on these 5 essential things, and they got mired in a middle income trap. It is vital that the government strategy of AatmaNirbhar is truly AatmaNirbhar by empowering the people of India, by enabling them to go to the market and procure these 5 things. They're produced by government or not, I have no view, but they must be available without subsidy and at sufficient quality for this structural change to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. It was a pleasure having you this morning. If I can come to you, Dr. Chaturvedi, there's been a worry expressed about, this whole economic recovery being K-shaped. And there is some criticism of the government on the measures that it has taken so far, that, the troubled sector, the stress sector, the services, which was hit the most during the pandemic, there wasn't much done about those sectors. And the thinking seemed to be that, the rising tide will lift all the sectors. Do you feel that there should have been a more targeted stimulus in the budget or more targeted measures to lift the particular troubled sectors?
Thank you. Thanks, Deepshika. I'm glad your discussion is very well covered in our discussion in terms of how government sectoral responses have evolved. I think if you look at, and Ratin in his previous round of response had mentioned a greater focus that is needed on labor-intensive sectors. This budget has announced 7 textile parks, for instance, and we are seeing a similar commitment for leather sector. Being very closely involved with Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, I'm seeing the CSIR led National Leather Research Institute in Chennai, which is doing marvelous job in terms of leather exports and having an ecosystem with the leather exporting firms from not only Chennai, but Kanpur, Agra, the whole belt, which is intensive in leather production. So you are seeing a situation where labor-intensive sectors are getting a huge impetus, support, and potential for their export is being leveraged by the new strategies that are coming in. Having said that, I think it is also important for us to see, as I said earlier, how is the agriculture export opportunities are coming up. And there, Deepshika, I think greater efforts are needed in terms of giving support to our value-added exports from agriculture sector. The Finance Commission has already recommended providing additional support to those states which are making efforts in terms of agriculture value-added support. particularly the food processing sector. And I think the announcements, 4 of those announcements, particularly for fisheries sector, I think are going to be extremely important. The fact that this issue is also coming up in a major way in the forthcoming WTO ministerial, where Indian fisheries sector subsidies are sort of under attack, and those of us who are involved in the discussions are aware of the fact that both EU and a set of Southeast Asian countries which are sort of seeing us in competition are going to challenge this in a major way. And that, I think, is something which would be extremely important for us to address. So the whole strategy of focusing on labor-intensive sectors to avoid more inequalities in the economy would be important. And for that, I feel trade would play an extremely important role. We have already discussed the new narrative that we require, both on technology as well as on trade, and their convergence probably would give a new fillip to our production architecture that we need. And from that perspective, I feel it is important that the new growth strategy should focus that. The budget has already given attention on this. Probably more efforts by the line ministries would be extremely important.
We need to wind up because the next panel's already here. But quickly, if I can come to you, Soumya, and after that, Dr. Shah, and then Dr. Rajat Kuturia, 2 points, 2 suggestions that can be sent out to the government on how to make AatmaNirbhar Bharat more effective and help it deliver.
Yes, I'll just mention the 2 points very quickly. But before that, let me give you a statistics which actually will surprise all of you. If you make a cross-country comparison of the manufacturing value added of top world manufacturer, that shows that between 2004 and 17, China gained 18% of the market share in manufacturing GVA, while India had gained 1.5%. Interestingly, this was the second highest. So after China, India had actually gained second highest share in manufacturing value added, and overall India is the 6th largest in global manufacturing share at 3%. However, the per capita manufacturing is still on the lower side. So that actually, and the respective increase was actually less than 1% for each country. So this shows the wide disparity in the manufacturing space when you compare China with other countries, and India is perhaps no exception, but India was the second highest over this period of 13 years. Now, having said that, if you ask me what are the 2 specific things which the government needs to do, the first thing is that I think it has announced an extremely well-intentioned budget. I think the ideas of this DFI institution, the ideas of spending up infrastructural investment, the ideas of a large disinvestment exercise, and the ideas, of course, of a bad bank. I think these are extremely well-intentioned achievements, and I would like to see that most of these which have been announced in the budget are passed very quickly, maybe in the forthcoming cabinet meetings or something like that, so that it hits the ground very quickly. Because we need to understand that we have a fairly large disinvestment exercise this time, and this will showcase our resolve, which the Prime Minister has said that we need to give the private sector its due in terms of its wealth creation, and this is very important signal that the markets is to get. The second point is that I think there has been a whole lot of initiatives which has been announced in the budget for the some of the sectors, like which will bring back social capital, which invest in human capital. Healthcare is one of them, and I'd like to see that more of public and private partnerships actually taking space. I think whenever I talk of triple P, that's a word which may not be liked by a lot of people, but in my sense, that is one way forward. And now is the best time because we have a reasonably lower interest rates. Corporate sector has significantly deleveraged, and there are incipient signs of private investment coming back. So now is the best space to leverage this one. And if we can leverage this one and build up some of the opportunities in the human capital sector, that will be extremely beneficial for a country like us.
Dr. Shah, 2 points.
Well, first I would just emphasize what I think everybody's been saying, Ratin, Sachin, Rajat, Soumya, that the messaging has to be clearer. This is not AatmaNirbhar. This really should be Vishwanirbhar. This is us saying we are getting ready to face the world. We want to be one of the largest economies in the world. We want to conquer the world. And you're not going to do that by simply saying, let's be self-reliant. So I think that is very, very crucial. And, from that flows a whole range of different things that clarify for everybody. We started with Make in India in 2014. We've now landed up at AatmaNirbhar. Somewhere along the way, things have got very confusing. And that confusion will then see itself through as bureaucrats and very intelligent officers of the government try to implement what inherently is an extremely complex situation. So that would be, I think, the first message. The second really is that just as we try to build our manufacturing base, though yes, a bit later than we should have been, we are faced with crises still in so many different areas, basic areas where the state needs to really improve its performance. And mostly they're in health and education. I think doing those public good things, what economists call public goods, where you're being highly literate is a boon for me, because I then don't have to translate my sophisticated or unsophisticated ideas to you because you are literate too. So those kinds of externalities are vital for any country to be competitive globally. And it's going to be very, very important. And, the budget does lay emphasis on this, at least in the health sector. But we clearly need to revamp and rethink our health systems and our education systems. Because without that foundation, you really cannot have any kind of self-confidence or any kind of competitiveness in the world today. We are still a country that, by and large, on average, learns by rote. It does not learn by problem solving. So when I see in my own institution a highly qualified economist trained entirely in India, and I compare him with a colleague who has partially been trained abroad, and she brings skills which I sometimes feel my Indian colleague who's just been trained in India should have. And so those are some of the ways in which we can truly be Vishwanirbhar, and that would be my message.
Okay. Dr. Kathuria, quickly 2 points, because the other panels now just waiting.
Yes, thanks, Deepika. I won't sort of repeat, and I agree with the recommendations of both Sachin and Shekhar. 2 points quickly. One, I think we should eschew protectionism, whether in reality or perceived. We should participate much more in global value chains, because that's the only way to become competitive. And the focus should not be on net value add in India. The focus should be on getting those value chains. And then, as Ratin said, we can do the tasks of greater complexity over a period of time by learning, by doing. So participate more in global value chains. It's the time for India to embrace global markets, get into bilateral agreements much more, and not be sort of obsessed with things like current account deficits, bilateral deficits, and think about sustainability in a broader sense rather than in a narrow sense. And the second message I would give is what this government has been saying for a long time, started first by Mr. Jaitley in his budget speech in 2014-15, and then reiterated by Nirmala ji in her speech this time, which is minimum government and maximum governance. And as India transitions to a much more market-based economy, when public sector exits and disinvestment and privatization will mean that the public sector will exit many of the things that it's been doing, you need much better governance to manage the private sector. I agree with that, because market failures are endemic, but to deal with market failures are tasks of high complexity, and therefore we need government to govern, not to produce, but to govern, and to provide that administrative capability. So complex governance is needed, and that is what the government should be focusing on: capacity building, getting expertise from the private sector wherever necessary, but doing the role of best governance or maximum governance, as they've been emphasizing.
Right. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Mr. Kocher. Sorry for getting this panel, I think, ending a bit late. Thank you all very much. Dr. Shah, Dr. Chaturvedi, Soumya, Dr. Kathuria.
Thank you so much, Deepika. It was such an engrossing conversation that I felt if you could possibly give it some more time. Unfortunately, we do not have that luxury. These online seminars are like live television now. So thank you so much and look forward to your next discussion.